Go ahead and start, given our usual buffer. So Hanukkah Sameach to everyone. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Hope that everyone is having a good celebration. Yes? Maybe? So?
Yes.
Okay. Well, looking for a little enthusiasm here. All right, so we are going to be studying from Parashat Miketz, which is about Joseph's rise. Remember, we talked a little bit about this last week. And how does Joseph come to the attention of Pharaoh? Dreams. That is to say, he interprets Pharaoh's dreams. And Pharaoh's dreams have these 7 cows that eat 7 other cows and 7 stalks of grain and all of that. And the basic interpretation is, what's that? Famine.
Feast and famine.
Feast and then famine, right? We're going to have 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. So what's the solution?
Save up some of the food from the years of plenty and portion it out during the years of famine.
All right, so we're going to store, right? Store it up during the times of abundance, right? And then we're going to
Use it up.
what's that?
Dispense. So it's either feast or famine.
Then we're going to dispense it during the time of famine. Who and how much is doing this?
Joseph took charge.
Joseph took charge. So does that mean that Joseph is going to take all of the extra food and store it? Does that mean the average Egyptians are going to be storing it?
He was kind of the architect of the policy and process.
Well, he was the architect of identifying what the crisis was going to be, and definitely he is put in charge of the solution. But you might be surprised that we have less information about exactly how the solution was carried out than you might have thought. And that's what we're going to be looking at. Because what we're dealing with here is essentially a question of what role does this foreigner and this government have in taxing and distributing during times of plenty and times of need. Make sense? We're going to see that there's a big debate about one word which may seem simple, but we'll go through it, and as usual we'll have to point out that the JPS translation smears the topic, and we'll unpack it a bit. All right, so we are on page 253 in the 8th time, which is chapter 41 of the book of Genesis, and we're going to start with the after interpretation of the dream. So Joseph has just finished interpreting the dream about 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, and now he is, like any good self-promoter, going to recommend a course of action. He doesn't just leave it with dream interpretation, but is moving straight into a policy recommendation. Okay? So we have a volunteer for verse 33, which is the very last verse on page 253. Oh. Edie, you haven't read it, I don't think, for a while. Go for it.
Accordingly, let Pharaoh find a man of discernment and wisdom, and set him over the land of Egypt.
And who do we know that's wise? Well, how about somebody that can interpret dreams? Okay, keep going.
And let Pharaoh take steps to appoint overseers over the land and organize the land of Egypt in the 7 years of plenty.
We're going to pause there, okay? Seemingly innocuous phrase, right? I don't know whether anyone here looking around, has anyone brought another edition or translation? There's a translation choice taking place in this verse that is not actually obvious. And if we had anybody here with a King James version or some of the older versions of Jewish scholarship as well, we would find a different interpretation. If you look in verse 34, and if you look at the second half of the verse, basically, it says that you should appoint these people over the land, v'chimesh et eretz Mitzrayim. V'chimesh. Anybody have any inklings of what would chimesh mean? Does it sound similar to any?
Yes,
Chamesh. It sounds like a word, right? 5. And in fact, we're going to find cognates of the word 5 later on, basically meaning a fifth, right? So to answer our question of how much, we might begin by saying a fifth or 20%. And indeed, there are many that argue that what this word should be translated as is not organize the land, but take a fifth tax 20% of the abundant years, and that's what should be stored. And if you take 20% from each of the years, you'll be fine. But that's not the only definition, as we just saw. Instead, it might be defined as organized. And we'll talk about the different commentators and why they argue one way or another in more detail. But let's get the rest of the plan outlined.
Let all the food of these good years that are coming be gathered, and let the grain be collected under Pharaoh's authority as food to be stored in the cities. Let that food be a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which will come upon the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish in the famine.
Go ahead and keep going.
I'm waiting for you.
No, I'm not going to interrupt you here.
You fooled me.
Sorry.
The plan pleased Pharaoh and all his courtiers. And Pharaoh said to his courtiers, could we find another like him, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is none so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my court, and by your command shall all my people be directed. Only with respect to the throne shall I be superior to you. Pharaoh further said to Joseph, see, I put you in charge of all the land of Egypt. And removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand, and he had him dressed in robes of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command, and they cried before him, Habrek. Thus he placed him over all the land of Egypt.
All right, local boy makes good. Joseph has risen from the pit, quite literally, and is now the second in command over the entire land of Egypt. And he's going to be responsible for this policy of ensuring that there is proper storage during the times of abundance, so that during the time of famine, everything will be taken care of. Sound good? Okay, we're not done with the plan quite yet. Go ahead and keep going.
Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, yet without you no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh then gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him for a wife Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Thus Joseph emerged in charge of the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Leaving Pharaoh's presence, Joseph traveled through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 years of plenty, the land produced in abundance, and he gathered all the grain of the 7 years that the land of Egypt was enjoying, and stored the grain in the cities. He put in each city the grain of the fields around it. So Joseph collected produce in very large quantity, like the sands of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured.
Okay, so he gets married and he starts his job. And how much grain is he collecting?
It says all of it, but you said 20%.
Well, like I said, that wonderful word chimesh could mean 20%.
But he can't collect it all. They have to eat during the years of plenty too.
But it could also, if we're not going to go with chimesh as being a number, but instead use it as the word to organize, and we'll see there is a basis for doing so, then we could read this very literally as he collected all the grain. Now, how could he collect all the grain? Because people do need to eat, right?
Because it says he's an overseer when we saw the beginning, which means he enslaved the Egyptians as well. And he took their stuff where they were as slaves to him.
Well, we'll talk about the issue of slavery, but one step removed from slavery where you actually own the person would be simply to say, look, Joseph instituted a policy where everything that was gathered went through a government verification process. and you were allowed to keep a certain amount, and a certain amount was also stored of undetermined quantity, but apparently an awful lot of it. And so therefore you would say Joseph didn't take the food away from them, but it was processed through government oversight, so that nothing was harvested without having been properly counted by the government. And the government allowed you to keep a certain portion, and the government stored the rest of it so that when the famine came, people would have enough to eat.
Sounds sort of familiar like today. The government takes a look at every dime that I make, oversees it, takes a portion, and lets me keep some. Let me keep some.
And we can argue about how much is too much or how much is too little.
And you probably would argue about that here too. How much is too much food for them to keep and how much...
If you know a famine is coming.
Okay.
So that would be the way to interpret this, to say that it wasn't about a 20th that was being reserved, but that 100% of it was being checked so that they knew exactly how much food was grown, and then a wise amount was being set aside. And that apparently was the decision made by Joseph. And that number may have been more than 20%, it may have been less than 20%. And we're going to see the commentators argue about that. Make sense? So we have, we're still able to read this in both directions. Either he was looking at all the food and took 20%, or he was looking at all the food and took a wise percent. Make sense? Yes? All right. One more paragraph and then we'll get to our commentaries.
Before the years of famine came, Joseph became the father of 2 sons, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, meaning God has made me forget completely my hardship and my parental home. And the second he named Ephraim, meaning God has made me fertile in the land of my affliction.
Okay, so before all of this famine stuff starts, while it's still in the time of plenty, he's also producing his own, that is to say, producing offspring. And we'll throw this in as at the very end of why the Torah bothers to tell us when precisely Ephraim and Manasseh were born. Okay? How are we doing?
Just clarification.
Yes.
Potiphar is not the same as Potiphar.
Depends who you ask.
Oh.
So there are indeed commentaries which suggest that Potiphar was Potiphar. There we go. And that in the end, this is sort of in vindication of his fidelity to his former master and to not transgressing the laws against adultery, that he was rewarded with Potiphar's daughter as his bride. But the commentaries are divided on that issue of whether this was exactly him or not. Okay, how are we doing? Got the handouts? Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right, so let's take a straightforward reading. This is the reading of Rashbam and the reading of Ibn Ezra. That takes our chimesh to mean a fifth. Who'd like to read? Don't all volunteer at once. Thanks, Steve.
The chimesh, and let him appoint overseers, and take up the 5th part, that the overseers should collect 1/5 of all the crops for the needs of the king, where the general law in other years was to take 1/10, as it states in Shmuel, and your fields he will take 1/10. 1 Shmuel 8:14.
From the book of Samuel, exactly.
Now you will take twice that, and similarly did Joseph do at the end, Bereshit 47, verse 26.
Which is in next week's parasha.
And Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt unto this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th.
Okay, so both Rashbam and Ibn Ezra take the line that this word chimesh means 5th. And they do it for 2 reasons. They say, well, a 5th would be perfectly logical, because in an average year, the king would get a 10th. And we know that because in the book of Samuel, it talks about the king taking a 10th. Make sense so far? So if this is going to be an emergency enactment, then doubling it would make a lot of sense, because you want to store up twice as much during the good years in order that you'll have extra for the bad years. All right, very reasonable. And they also add that we can assume that this means a 5th because we know definitively in next week's parasha, in chapter 47, that when he makes the final deal with the Egyptians, that they end up being sharecroppers for Pharaoh in perpetuity, and they owe Pharaoh 20% of their crop every year. Okay? Now, let's just make sure we understand how we get to that, because that's going to be one of the underlying questions here. After the famine years come, and Joseph begins to distribute the grain, he makes the Egyptians pay for it. You know the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch? So we talked about storing and then dispensing, but we are dispensing for money. That is to say, for the average Egyptian to get the food back from the storehouses, they have to pay. And when they run out of cash, they have to give their animals. And when they run out of animals, they have to sell their land to Pharaoh. And when they run out of land, they sell themselves. But rather than turn them into complete slaves, there's a certain indentured servitude thing going on here. Instead, Joseph says, you don't have to give 100% of your food, but you have to give 20% of your food. And that definitively, clearly, the Hebrew is unambiguously saying they owe 20% to Pharaoh from then on forever, in exchange for giving them back the food that Joseph had stored. Does that make sense? Anyone have a problem with that?
Well, yeah, it's a big problem.
What's the big problem?
It sounds like a preconceived plan to take land from the landowners, give it to the government, and then turn them into serfs. It's feudalism. It's the model for feudalism.
It very much sounds like serfdom. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail with Joseph's role in this because it's very interesting. I came across some other commentaries recently that pointed out that Joseph may have actually been protecting the Egyptians. That is to say, the Pharaoh's plan may have been, I want everybody, my slave, 100% of their crops come to me, and I'll give them a living ration. But instead, Joseph mitigated that by saying, no. Yes, everything technically belongs to the Pharaoh, but you're only going to be required to give 20%, which is a much better deal than when you're a slave. When you're a slave and you work in a field, how much do you get to keep for yourself? 0.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're a sharecropper, very often the percentages in the ancient world was an 80-20 split. You kept 80%, you gave 20% to the landowner.
Well, do we know the baseline economic process at the time? I mean, did the folks own their own land then?
At the time is the difficult question.
Yeah.
So trying to find the precise chronology of where Joseph would fit into what we know of Egyptian records and the Egyptian imperial system is very tricky. There have been people who have tried to find, which guy along the Egyptian ranks was actually Joseph with an Egyptian name, but none of them survive close scrutiny. So we're not sure who Joseph was in the Egyptian roles, and we're not sure exactly when these policies came into effect in Egyptian history. But we do know the idea that the priestly class gets special treatment, which the Torah corroborates, and we do know that the people owed the Pharaoh a certain percentage. It is corroborated by Egyptian sources. We're just not entirely sure when that structure came to exist.
But it does have a reading ahead, which I probably shouldn't have done.
That's okay.
So Joseph gained possession of all the farmland of Egypt to Pharaoh, every Egyptian having sold his field, because the famine was too much for them. Thus the land passed over to Pharaoh, and he removed the population, town by town, from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not take over.
Right.
Because the priests had it a lot.
Right. Removing the population is not about urbanization. It's about moving people so they don't feel they had a right to the land they were on. There's no longer have an ancestral
Took
ownership.
everything away from them.
Correct.
And told them exactly what it sounds sort of communistic a little bit too, but it's what Stalin did.
Well, except, at least in the original Marx version of communism, you weren't supposed to have one guy at the top getting all the money.
Well, the original Joseph version, he wasn't supposed to do this either.
Well, and that's the
How
question.
about-
Wait a minute. Why is it that the Egyptians are having to pay to get their own food back? Right?
That's
And
government for you.
what's that?
That's the government.
That's the government
That's
for you.
government.
It is a little equivalent. Imagine if you had your 401k plan, right, that you've been, investing your money in, that was, set up through a government system to provide, X structure, and then to get your money out of the 401k, you have to pay.
still get it.
That's social security.
What's that?
That's what social security is.
You mean in terms of
You put
being,
in,
And
and,
take it out, they tax you for it.
You have to pay that.
You do have
You
to
still
pay.
have to pay taxes.
You do.
oh, so it makes perfect sense, problem solved.
Yeah.
But wait a minute. Why
It's a
is
management
it,
fee.
but wait a minute.
Oh,
Why is it then that the Egyptians had to go to Joseph in the first place? Why couldn't they just store the food for themselves?
Because they would hate it.
They were
They would-
organized.
With the organizer and oversight.
Well, who needs to oversee, right? Can't they save for themselves? I mean, why do you need Joseph to save? Why do you need the central government to save? You know, why couldn't the Egyptians have just saved their own food? Now that they've got the warning,
That's why most of the people in this country have no savings.
well, there are too many cool things to buy.
Exactly.
and there's no incentive.
They spend all their money on iPods and fast cars.
And then the government will take care of you when you run out. Which is what Joseph is gonna do.
And food stamps.
It's perfectly reasonable that you need some, I think, some other agent to help you to structure your savings.
Well, certainly we do know historically that pre-central assistance for savings or retirement and such, poverty among the elderly was a huge problem. Even though there was every incentive to save, most people lived in a state of life where they didn't have the option of saving. And we can argue whether our current situation is the same as it was in the 20th century, but that's a much longer argument. Let's take a look and see how some of the other commentators handle this question of chimesh, and we'll see if we can get a little bit more traction. Who was reading? It's just these. So let's go and see what the Rashi version is.
As it's in Targum, Onkelos, and organize, encourage.
So in the Targum Onkelos, which is an Aramaic translation of the Torah, the word that he uses in Aramaic means to organize or to encourage, to rally the nation. So rather than saying chimesh means a fifth, what he did, and this is the way JPS translates it, was simply to organize the country, and no specific quantity was given. And the proof text for this, or at least a parallel text, comes from the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, where it says that this is what's done with our people, that we are organized, that we are divided into groups and camps and made prepared. So the verb chimesh can mean either. Both are plausible explanations. One just a general organization, and the other a specific amount of taxation. Following this so far? Okay, let's go ahead then and see how Rabbi Hirsch handles this.
In years of abundance, human nature is to eat double, and during years of famine, human nature is to eat half of what one normally intakes. Hence, in years of high quantity, one would eat 4 times what one eats in a famine year.
All right, we got the math here? Yes? Maybe? All right, I just want to make sure, because it's a very interesting psychological calculation here, that when things are good, let's say the average, your average harvest is 100 units of wheat, of grain, of calories, whatever you want to call it. And so in a good year, in a bumper year, you're taking in 200, right? And in a bad year, you're taking in 50. So the difference between 250 is 4 times. If there's a 4 times difference in terms of how much you're able to eat, how much you're able to afford between the worst year and the best year. Make sense? Okay, keep going.
The 1/5 formula ensured that even in the famine years, there would be enough to go around.
Okay, and that's from Rabbi Sensen, Raphael Hirsch. So the 1/5 formula says, well, if you take 1/5 of 200 every year,
It's 50.
it's what?
50.
50? I think it's 40, right? My math isn't great, but I think it's
I think it's
40.
40.
And so if you take the 40 and you add it to the 50, you get 90, which is pretty darn close to an average year's harvest. So Rabbi Hirsch argues that this word chimesh must have meant fifth, because that fifth, not coincidentally, works out to give you a pretty much average calorie intake for the bad years. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's one more argument for why to do it a fifth, because a fifth makes sense. If you assume that people are going to eat all of their extra produce, that is, as Michael put it, that there's human nature, that if you've got abundance, you don't think about saving it, you think about eating it. Because, it's a lot of food, let's eat it. Yes, no, maybe? Going to argue with the human psychology?
Certain foods can't be saved.
Certain
Like fresh
foods-
produce.
Certain foods can't be saved. If you've got a whole bunch of grapes, there's only so many raisins you can make, and only so fast you can eat the raisins before even the raisins rot. That there is a certain problem with spoilage. And indeed, Rashi's explanation
Is that their grain which they had stored had decayed, except that of Joseph.
So Rashi answers this question of why are the Egyptians going to Joseph when they could have stored the grain themselves, not by saying they ate it all themselves, not by saying that they were just, greedy, but by saying their grain rotted and Joseph's grain didn't. After all, he's the smart guy. He knew how to store it better. So the Egyptians end up turning to Joseph and end up turning to the king because they're the only ones left with non-spoiled food. You following that logic? Because after all, even if we take Rabbi Hirsch's breakdown, and we say, let's say the government was taking 40 from the 200, right? Well, that still left the individual farmer with 160 units of food. Well, he could have socked away privately 40 units of food and still had a bonus 20 every year during the good years to live it up. So, if that's the case, then there should be really no reason for them to be going to Joseph, because there was more than double the amount of food being grown every year to store it away. But if my 40% that was privately stored spoils, who's going to pick up the tab? Right? And that would explain then why Pharaoh felt perfectly justified charging the people for the food. Because the Pharaoh's stores were not the only stores in town. They just happened to be the only stores that didn't spoil. And the people did try to save on their own, but their savings were destroyed. Looking at lots of quizzical expressions.
It sort of forces one to ask, didn't they ever experience famine before? Didn't they know there's grain would spoil? And shouldn't they have fed it to their animals as soon as possible? Because you can keep it in your animals by growing it.
Was this the first famine ever?
And why did theirs spoil and why did Joseph's remain whole? Was it because of God's intervention on his part? That's fine, but tell us.
There is a midrash about the spoilage, which says that if you put the soil from the land that the food is grown in, that keeps it from spoiling. I have no agricultural experience to say whether that midrash is scientifically valid or not, but at least our rabbis were also aware that one group of food not spoiling compared to another group of food not spoiling, both harvested at the same time, would seem a little strange. And so they were attributing it to Joseph's knowledge, that Joseph knew better ways to store the food than the average Egyptian. We could argue then, well, why didn't he tell them the better ways to store the food? But on the other hand, he was beholden to Pharaoh. And as we see in the end, Pharaoh makes out like a bandit from this arrangement. Perhaps. Perhaps. So is it fair? Not fair to whom?
To the Egyptians, Egyptian people.
Why?
They should have been given instructions on how to save the food.
So presumably if there was a better way to store, they should have been told the better way to store. Okay, but let's assume that maybe, the idea that their grain rotted and Joseph's didn't wasn't due to a mistake, but was due to just what happened. It was dumb luck. It was divine intervention. Not their fault, and not the government's fault, not Joseph's fault for not instructing them. Maybe grain just stores better in massive silos than it does in the back of your barn. That could very much be true. And again, I'm not an agricultural expert, but I could easily see how giant grain warehouses made of big, bricks would be a lot better storage than the hut at the back of your field, which is subject to all sorts of animals and pilfering and various things that can come in and rot.
But if this was not the first famine, so why weren't the people smart enough to know, well, his grain is thriving and ours is not. Let's find out what he's doing that we're not doing, and thereby maybe sending spies to look and see
To see what the government's grain silos are doing?
Yeah.
Well, certainly this wasn't the first famine, but a 7-year famine is quite severe. That is to say, that likely was not a typical arrangement. We can tell by the shocking nature of the dream as it's described, but this seems to be a major catastrophe that is unanticipated. The idea that there might be 1 or 2 years without famine, that people can somewhat understand. But the idea that there's going to be a massive famine that will last 7 years, that the people may not have been properly prepared to respond to. Left to their own devices, they may have had 1 or 2 years worth of stored food to handle through the lean years, but nobody would have anticipated a 7-year cycle that they would have needed to have storage for. And we can see some of that, by the way, by the fact that the brothers don't come down from Canaan the first month of the famine. That is to say, Jacob and his remaining sons do seem to be able to weather the beginning of the famine. And it's only when the famine is going on multiple years that they come down looking for food, and that's why Joseph tells them, hey, the famine ain't over yet, move down here because we still got like 5 more years to go. So that is something we can guess from the context, that they knew how to handle minor famines, but no one anticipated a famine of this scale. Make sense? Maybe? Okay, but is it fair? Is it fair? Is what Pharaoh does fair? Is what Joseph organizes for Pharaoh fair? Is it fair that they take 20% or some other amount from the people before the famine hits?
Yes, if the populace knew that there was going to be a famine, you're depositing this in your famine account, and you'll be able to get it back later on.
But they don't just get it back. They have to buy it back.
I know they have to buy it back. They're probably not told that.
Okay, so the 20% grain tax sounds fair if it was going to be returned freely. That is to say, the argument is that the government was going to be able to store it better by proof in the pudding's in the eating. Apparently they did. And therefore, asking the people to give that 20% to allow it to come back to them would be fine.
I'd even say that, some percentage of handling fee, storage fee and all that sort of stuff.
Someone had to build the grain cities after all. Someone had to administer it. Someone had to continue to, pay for the army and everything else that goes on in the government.
As it says, the store or compel them to share in the destruction of the town.
Well, we haven't got to that line yet. But let's go ahead and get to that line now. So Judaism actually discusses issues of communal obligation and financial obligation in quite a few different places. But one of the most famous is here from the beginning of Baba Batra. So who would like to chime in on this? Who wants to share a little Jewish tax law? Please.
They compel him to share in the construction of the town wall, double gates, and the crossbar.
All right, and by him they mean a resident of the city. So if you are a resident of a town, as opposed to just a traveler passing through, then if the town decides they want to build a wall around the town, they can force every resident of that town to contribute to building the wall. Understood? Sound good? They don't ask every individual, would you like a wall or would you like to contribute to our wall donation fund? They say, if you live here, you are going to help pay for that wall. and the gates and the bar that make it a secure structure.
Is there anything that limits the power of government to say whatever they want? Well, power does sort of tend to corrupt. I mean, I don't want to be around too. But if they have all the power to say anything they want, there's no limit.
Okay, well, let's see. How do you decide then how much each person pays?
Would there have been a referendum in the town to determine whether they wanted them all?
It would have been determined by the town elders, which served at the passive or tacit consent of the people. So that doesn't.
Voted on.
It would have been voted in a sort of consensual building way by the elders, but the elders would have been more or less chosen by being acceptable to the population. And if the population really didn't like them, they could have always had a revolution. But that was a very extreme form of getting rid of the people who were in charge.
Yeah, because this is not a democracy. There's no voting here.
It's not a pure democracy. It's not a pure dictatorship either, because you don't have one person at the top who has control of all the force.
Well, we got Pharaoh
No. This is and in Egypt, yes, in Egypt we have a dictatorship.
we changed places.
But we're talking here not about the Egyptian society. We're talking about Jewish towns,
Okay.
and so they have a different setup. Okay, but we still have a question. Let's see if we can understand the issues here before we get to the text. It might make it a little bit clearer. If this is my house, right? And this is your house, and we build a wall around the town, who should pay more?
Bigger house,
What's that?
larger house.
The larger house. Okay, so let's make that clear. Let's say this is my house, right? It's a bigger house. That's my art for bigger house. So one answer should be, well, it should just be a straight percentage, right? If I've got more property, if I've got more valuables, then the wall is protecting my stuff, more of my stuff than yours. Therefore, I benefit from the wall more than you do, because I've got more to lose, right? If robbers come in, if the marauding bands come into the town and they steal my stuff, I lose more than you, because I'm rich and you're not. Neener. And therefore, I benefit from the wall more than you do. And therefore, I should contribute more to the wall than you should.
Sounds like Obama's argument.
There you go.
So one argument would be you need a what we call now a progressive tax system, which is to say those who benefit more should pay more. Okay, now notice this isn't yet, at least in this stage of the argument, saying it's just because I'm richer. It's saying because I'm richer, I stand to lose more, therefore I benefit more than you do. Okay? If it was just a case of life and limb, not about protecting my stuff, but just so I don't die, the argument can go, this guy should pay more, because he's closer. Which means if all the bandits are coming in to attack from outside, chances are they're going to hit all of the people who live on the outside of the town, steal or kill their stuff, and leave before they get to the middle of the town. And therefore the people at the perimeter of the city benefit more from the wall than the people in the interior. And therefore the people on the perimeter should pay the price, or pay a larger proportion of the price. What's that?
I said that's how we do it now.
That's how we do it now, the people on the edge?
Middle class pays more,
Because we're on the edge?
What
basically.
about the association dues?
Let's not get into the homeowner association. That's
It's basically the
That's
same.
different.
Some
Some
pay
some
more or
places are
less.
based on size, and others are just a flat fee for everybody.
Correct.
Everybody pays the same amount, regardless of the size of their unit.
Correct, but with homeowners associations, they are purely voluntary. That is to say, you choose to live in the neighborhood, you choose to be part of the association by choosing that house.
And
Whereas living in a country or living in a town is not necessarily something that's just voluntary, you're born there. And therefore you have a built-in obligation that you did not vote on or didn't choose by buying that particular house. At least for the vast majority of us. Some people can choose where they want to live. Most of us are pretty much stuck where we are, and certainly in their day and age, pretty much you were stuck where you were born for most of the people. So which is more fair? Charging the people who have more because they benefit more by protecting their stuff, or charging the people who live closer to the wall more because they're the most likely victims of any attacks, and therefore they're benefiting more, they're more likely to benefit from having a wall than someone who's in the middle of the town.
Now, that sounds like insurance.
That sounds like insurance, risk, it's risk
Yeah.
management, you pay according to your risk. If you live on the floodplain, you're paying more for your insurance than if you don't live on the floodplain. Okay? But on the other hand, if you have a very, 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 very expensive house, you also pay more for your insurance. Because if your house gets damaged, it's going to cost more to repair. What's that?
Yes.
Air conditioning.
Or give or take air conditioners, exactly, exactly. But how come we're not just saying flat?
Flat tax.
Everybody's in the town, everybody's in the same boat, we should all pay the same amount. Well, let's see
That's a third option.
what options get described in the Talmud. Now, Harry, do you want to keep reading?
Rabbi Eliezer inquired of Rabbi Yochanan, is the impost for the wall levied as a poll tax
Which means flat tax for everybody,
or according to means?
meaning how much you've got.
So he replied, it is levied according to means. And do you, Eliezer, my son, fix this ruling firmly in your mind? According to another version, Rabbi Eliezer asked Rabbi Yochanan whether the impost was levied in proportion to the proximity of the resident's house to the wall or to his means, and he replied, in proportion to the proximity of the house to the wall. And you, Eliezer, my son, fix this ruling firmly in your mind.
Okay, isn't it great when you got two versions that are contradictory? Isn't Talmud fun? Okay, but we did learn one thing. Which version is categorically not the way we measure the tax? Right. There's no poll tax, no flat tax. It's not. We're not just counting the number of heads and then dividing it by dividing the cost by the number of heads. Both versions of Rabbi Yochanan, as recorded here, even though they were supposed to be fixed firmly in mind, apparently they got fixed firmly in two different ways, have a means test. Now, one is saying it's according to the wealth of the homeowner, and the other is saying it's according to the proximity to the wall. But both of them say that the fair way to do it is according to the benefit that's being received. That was a good sigh.
Well, nobody's coming up with the idea of a percentage.
Mhm.
Say you pay 10%. 10% for your big house is more than 10% for my small house, but it ends up, but 10%, so now we don't have to argue over whether they're treating you better or...
But 10% is a means test.
Sort of, yes it is.
Because, it's saying if you have 1,000, 10% from you is going to be a lot more than the guy who has 10. So a flat percentage is a means test. The question is whether or not you want to make it a progressive means test, which means, 10% for the guy with 1,000 is not so bad for him, but 10% for the guy with only 10 seems a lot worse. And therefore, maybe we should make it 5% for the guy at the bottom and 30% for the guy at the top, in order that we get a proportion of what they actually have as disposable income once they paid for their basic necessities. And that's how you eventually end up with the American-style tax codes, where you're saying it's not just that a flat tax as a whole has a certain means test built into it, but it doesn't reflect necessarily every economic reality, which is that we don't all have the same amount of disposable income. Or we just say, no, it's not about, just a flat amount, it's about how much you're getting from it. If you benefit more from the public good that's being offered, then you should pay a larger proportion of it. So for example, if we were making something different, let's say we're going to make a well and fountain for the middle of the town, we would expect then,
Everybody to pay.
what's that?
Everybody to pay.
Well, what if I live out here?
They do.
But I'm not going to use the fountain as much as this guy.
Depends on whether there's a
Part of the
nice fountain.
community.
But that's not a necessity like a wall is. The wall is to protect you from marauders.
You don't think water is a necessity?
Not a fountain.
No, but fountains in the ancient world were not
that's
just,
where you got water.
that was where you got the water, sorry.
Okay,
It's
then
not,
we
it's
take
not,
the well.
sorry. You might decorate it, and then you can argue about whether you should bother decorating the fountain or not. But having a fountain so the water would be moving and flowing
So you're
was
talking about digging a well so that everybody can have access to the water.
either a well or an aqueduct,
Yes.
something to bring water to the community.
All right, just talk me into it.
But did I talk you into means testing it?
Yeah, I'm still...
If I have to walk 3 blocks to get to the fountain and he has to walk 30, do we both pay the same amount to build the fountain? Don't you want to be on the city council?
Depends on any other fountains in the town.
Depends if there's other
already.
fountains.
It's a public utility, and you should pay for it on the basis of how much you use.
So pay for it on the basis of how much you use. So that's the argument behind doing a gasoline tax, right? That if the more gasoline you use, the more roads you're using, because you're covering theoretically more miles, depending upon how bad a mileage your car you get, or how bad a mileage you get in your car. And therefore, you're using more gas because you're covering more roads, and that means you're wearing the roads out more than the guy who doesn't use any gas at all. And therefore, what's that?
I said, which reminds me, I must stop for gas on my.
Which reminds you to stop for gas. And therefore, it's a way of building in a use test, a benefit test, to the costs of the public upkeep of the public good of roads. Right? Sound good? Any problem with that kind of test?
I don't think that the proximity to the outside of the wall is a reason to charge more. Because once they break through the wall, it isn't just the people on the edge that will be affected, everybody will be affected.
So we may imagine that the marauders will hit and run on the outskirts of town, but there's still a very good chance, if they're intelligent marauders, that they'll go to the middle stuff, which hasn't been marauded, and get the good stuff.
I think that's...
And we do know historically that the people who lived on the outside of an unwalled town were generally not the wealthiest of people. Because if they were, they would live further into the middle where it was safer. And, they could afford that central property where there was more security.
Convenient.
Well, and often more convenient, although if you were a farmer, you wanted to be on the outskirts so you could get to your field. So it wasn't always an easy decision. Okay. And how do you collect all these taxes?
You hire tax collectors.
You hire tax collectors. Well, yes? No? Is there something wrong with being a tax collector?
Apparently so, yes.
Okay, so tax collectors don't really get good reputations in Jewish law. And in the interest of time, this middle paragraph is going to be skipped. It's just a question. It's just showing how the half shekel tax that was paid around the time of Purim, that was used for the upkeep of the temple and the sacrifices there, was gradually collected. That is to say, people were encouraged to pay voluntarily. They were then reminded, and then eventually they were forced. But the role of tax collector had a very, very unusual history in our ancient days, which is there were good tax collectors and there were bad tax collectors. Because tax collector could actually be a very lucrative job. It had happened in many ancient societies that you paid to be a tax collector. Okay? You bought that job. Because you would go to the king, the governor, the whoever, and you'd say, I can get you 1,000 gold pieces from this county. And I'll give you that 1,000 now for permission to run the taxes of this county. And what do you think the result would be?
Squeeze more than 1,000.
And you squeeze more than 1,000 out of the people. I mean, that's your profit. So the more you tax, the more you're able to extort from the populace. That's all bonus for you. You've already given up money to the king, and as long as you keep paying the 1,000 you promised him, you keep your job, and you try and walk that balance of how much can I squeeze out of the population before it collapses or rebels against the king and the king gets mad. And you keep the difference for yourself. And that's why being a tax collector was, in many times in Jewish history, not exactly considered to be the noblest of professions. And in fact, in many times, tax collectors were not allowed to give testimony. Tax collectors and gamblers were considered to be in the same category. Women was for a different reason. Women was for a different reason, but for tax collectors and gamblers, it was because they were considered to be unscrupulous people, and therefore you couldn't rely upon what they would say as being honest. Everybody knows, if you guys have ever watched Robin Hood, you know what the whole tax system was like. The sheriff of Nottingham was one of those kinds of tax collectors. It was his job to pay the king a certain amount, and then he squeezed the people for the rest. And that doesn't exactly make for a good relationship. And in fact, the next to last paragraph there, as it points out, as the tax farmers and tax collectors, doing penitence, doing tshuva is difficult. They return what they can to those whom they recognize, and the rest of the taxes that they propose to hand back, they make use for the public good. So they're basically saying if you're a tax collector, it's really, really hard to do tshuva for the sin you committed of tax collecting. It's not the taxes are the sin, as we're going to see. It's that you probably collected them in an extortionist manner and more than was necessary. And in doing so, you stole from the people. And trying to repent, means giving back what you stole. But can you remember where every single, zuz and denarii came from? Can you remember exactly how much you took from Mrs. Shapiro versus how much you took from Mr. Cohen when you were, breaking his kneecaps? You may not have those records because you were just taking everything you could. So what you remember, you give back, and the rest of it that you know was ill-gotten gains, you use for public good, which of course was what the original purpose was supposed to be. You were supposed to be using the taxes for the public good. Make sense? So Judaism has a real ambivalent view when it uses the word tax, because we were often the subject of unfair taxes, but we also had a very strong system of demanding communal participation in communal goods, whether it be educating children, or whether it be building a synagogue, or whether it be buying a Torah, or building the walls around a town. We have a system of saying everybody has to pay. And we argue about what exactly a fair share means, but we know that everyone needs to pay. And then we also have this relationship with non-Jewish tax collectors that are considered to be less scrupulous. Make sense? Maybe? All right, let's go ahead though and see how we deal with those other types of tax collectors. Would you like to read the middle paragraph? When does the statement
that a customs collector is considered to be a highwayman apply?
i.e., when is it legitimate to say the tax man is a thief?
Well, when the customs collector is a Gentile,
But, keep going.
a star worshiper, is self-appointed, or was appointed by the king, but is given unlimited jurisdiction and takes whatever he wants and leaves whatever he wants.
Which is the system that I was describing a second ago.
If, however, the customs collector was appointed by the king to take a third or fourth or any fixed amount, such a person is not considered to be a robber, because the law established by the king is binding law.
Okay, which is a Jewish principle, that even for non-Jewish kings, if the law is established as a law of the land, you follow the law of the land.
Right. It's a fixed amount, so you can't be that.
And the tax collector isn't just making it up as he goes along in order to squeeze more out of you for his own personal benefit. He is simply implementing the king's decree.
And in that case, indeed, anyone who does not pay this tax transgresses, because he is taking what is due the king.
All right, so if you don't pay your taxes, you are a thief, is what Rambam is saying here. If the taxes are being set by an appropriate authority. And appropriate authority even included non-Jewish kings. Make sense? Maybe? So I would say that in our current situation, you can argue that our current tax system is unfair. You can argue that the legislation needs to be changed. You can argue whatever point you want. But when it comes time to pay taxes, you have to pay whatever the law says you have to pay. You don't have to pay more. You don't have to volunteer to give the government money. But the idea that somehow you can hide money from the government in illegal ways, or that you can just simply choose not to pay what the government has said you should, means that you are actually committing a Jewish transgression, in addition to violating American law. I know it's a real fun thing to think about as we're just coming to the end of a tax year, but there it is. There is a notion that a fair law needs to be carried out, even if we disagree with it. And by fair, they're not necessarily saying we think the total usage of the law is fair. We think that it was made by an appropriate authority. In their day, kings; in our days, a modern democracy. Make sense? Maybe everyone going to feel better when they fill out that tax form? Not so much. Not so much. Not so much. So let's just finish with one little tangent to go back to this whole idea of personal responsibility as well. Remember, we talked about why didn't the Egyptians store more, and we argued that they could have stored more, and maybe they did store more, but they're spoiled for a variety of different reasons. But there's one other way you can mitigate the effects of famine. Who would like to read our last little comment here? All right, please keep going.
Said Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, "It is forbidden for a person to have sexual relations in times of famine," as it said. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of famine came.
Before the year of famine came is the emphasis that they're reading from that line. The reason the Torah interrupts the narrative and doesn't tell us about his children being born when he told us about him first getting married is to show us that he definitely had his kids before famine came. Because once famine came, he and his wife were not engaged in any hanky-panky that might lead to procreation. Why not?
Not enough food to feed.
It's another mouth to feed. By deliberately bringing another life into this world when it's not enough to pay for it, you are transgressing, because you are going to cause that child to suffer or cause others to suffer. Now, there's only one
There's
caveat.
another opinion, that's right.
Well, it's not another opinion, it's a
Well,
caveat.
A Tanaite statement, childless couples have sexual relations in years of famine.
Right, because if you don't have any children, then there is a commandment to be fruitful and multiply, and even during famine you should continue to work on that. But if you've already fulfilled that mitzvah, then when it comes lean years, you don't go looking for new mouths to feed. Seem obvious? And yet, how many of us are willing to practice self-denial in order that we can get through difficult times? You know, how many people, when they said, well, I know I just lost my job, but I really, really want to go on that go to that concert, or I really, really need the new iPhone, or I really, really want to go out to dinner because I deserve it because I'm having a rough week.
You know who did it? Our immigrant forebears, who when they came to this country, really worked hard and denied themselves a whole bunch of stuff
Absolutely.
in order to send us to college or whatever.
And there are many people who still do.
Yes, there
But
are.
unfortunately, there are also many who don't.
Yeah.
Which is why our tradition tries to remind us that you try and prepare, you try and save, you work together as a community to make sure that there is going to be enough for everyone, even if the private stockpile goes belly up. And when things are bad, you cut back. When things are bad, you do what is necessary so that you can get by without increasing your burden. Good advice, and hopefully we'll be heading into the 200. We'll be heading into the years of abundance in the future soon, speedily. But in the meantime, we continue as we always have. Take care and have a good Hanukkah for the last 4 nights, and hope to see everyone on Shabbat.
Did the American Haredim community ever read